17, Section 3, the North wins. Thanks to victories beginning with Gettysburg and ending with Richmond, the Union survived. One American story. Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain was a 32-year-old college professor when the war began. Determined to fight for the Union, he left his job and took command of troops from his home state of Maine. Like most soldiers, Chamberlain had gotten accustomed to the carnage of the Civil War. His description of the aftermath of one of the battles shows how soldiers got used to the war's violence. It seemed best to put myself between two dead men among the many left there by earlier assaults, and to draw another crosswise for a pillow out of the trampled, blood-soaked sod, pulling the flap of his coat over my face to fend off the chilling winds, and still more chilling, the deep, many-voiced moan of the wounded that overspread the field. During the war, Chamberlain fought in 24 battles. He was wounded 6 times and had 6 horses shot out from under him. He is best remembered for his actions at the Battle of Gettysburg, where he courageously held off a fierce rebel attack. In this section, you will read about the battle and others that led to the end of the Civil War. The road to Gettysburg. In September 1862, General McClellan stopped General Lee's northern attack at the Battle of Antietam, but the cautious McClellan failed to finish off Lee's army, which retreated safely to Virginia. President Lincoln, who was frustrated by McClellan, replaced him with Ambrose Burnside, but Burnside also proved to be a disappointment. At the Battle of Fredericksburg, Virginia, in December 1862, Burnside attacked Confederate troops who had dug trenches. The bloody result was 12,600 Union casualties. This disastrous attack led General Lee to remark, "It is well that war is so terrible, we should grow too fond of it." Lincoln replaced Burnside with General Joseph Hooker, who faced Lee following May at Chancellorsville, Virginia. The result was yet another Union disaster. With half as many men as Hooker, Lee still managed to cut the Union forces to pieces. However, the South paid a high price for its victory. As General Stonewall Jackson returned from patrol on May 2nd, Confederate guards thought he was a Union soldier and shot him in the arm. Shortly after a surgeon amputated the arm, Jackson caught pneumonia. On May 10, Lee's prize general was dead. In spite of Jackson's tragic death, Lee had to head north once again. He hoped that a Confederate victory in Union territory would fuel Northern discontent with the war and bring calls for peace. He also hoped that a Southern victory would lead European nations to give diplomatic recognition and aid to the Confederacy. The Battle of Gettysburg. In late June 1863, Lee crossed into southern Pennsylvania. The Confederates learned of a supply of shoes in the town of Gettysburg and went to investigate. There, on July 1st, they ran into Union troops. Both sides called for reinforcements, and the Battle of Gettysburg was on. The fighting raged for 3 days. On the rocky hills and fields around Gettysburg, 90,000 Union troops under the command of General George Meade clashed with 75,000 Confederates. During the struggle, Union forces tried to hold their ground on Cemetery Ridge, just south of town, while rubber soldiers tried to dislodge them. At times, the air seemed full of bullets. The balls were whizzing so thick, said one Texan, that it looked like a man could hold out his hat and catch it full. The turning point came on July 3rd, when Lee ordered General George Pickett to mount a direct attack on the middle of the Union line. It was a deadly mistake. Some 13,000 rebel troops charged the ridge into heavy Union fire. One soldier recalled bayonets thrust, saber strokes, pistol shot, men going down on their hands and knees, spinning round like tops, ghastly heaps of dead men. Pickett's charge, as this attack became known, was torn to pieces. The Confederates retreated and waited for a Union counterattack. But once again, Lincoln's generals failed to finish off Lee's army. The furious Lincoln wondered if he would find a general who would defeat Lee once and for all. Even so, the Union rejoiced over a victory at Gettysburg. Lee's hopes for a Confederate victory in the North were crushed. The North had lost 23,000 men, but Southern losses were even greater. Over one-third of Lee's army, 28,000 men, lay dead or wounded. Sick at heart, Lee led his army back to Virginia. The Siege of Vicksburg. On July 4th, 1863, the day after Pickett's charge, the Union received more good news. In Mississippi, General Ulysses S. Grant had defeated Confederate troops at the Siege of Vicksburg. The previous year, Grant had won important victories in the West that opened up the Mississippi for travel deep into the South. Vicksburg was the last major Confederate stronghold on that river. Grant had begun his attack on Vicksburg in May 1863, but when his direct attack failed, he settled for a long siege. Grant's troops surrounded the city and prevented the delivery of food and supplies. Eventually, the Confederates ran out of food. In desperation, they ate mules, dogs, and rats. Finally, after nearly a month and a half, they surrendered. The Union victory fulfilled a major part of the Anaconda Plan. The North had taken New Orleans the previous spring. Now, with complete control over the Mississippi River, the South was split in two. With the victories at Vicksburg and Gettysburg, the tide of the war turned in favor of the North. Britain gave up all thought of supporting the South, and General Grant, President Lincoln, found a man who was willing to fight General Lee. Sherman's Total War. In March 1864, President Lincoln named General Grant commander of all the Union armies. Grant developed a plan to defeat the Confederacy. He would pursue Lee's army in Virginia, while Union forces under William Tecumseh Sherman pushed through the Deep South to Atlanta and the Atlantic coast. Battling southward from Tennessee, Sherman took Atlanta in September 1864. He then set out on a march to the sea, cutting a path of destruction up to 60 miles wide and 300 miles long through Georgia. Sherman waged total war, a war not only against enemy troops, but against everything that supports his enemy. His troops tore up rail lines, destroyed crops, and burned and looted towns. Sherman's triumph in Atlanta was important for Lincoln. In 1864, the president was running for re-election, but his prospects were not good. Northerners were tired of war, and Democrats, who had nominated George McClellan, stood a good chance of winning on an anti-war platform. Sherman's success changed all that. Suddenly, Northerners could sense victory. Lincoln took 55% of the popular vote and won re-election. In his second inaugural speech, Lincoln hoped for a speedy end to the war. With malice towards none and charity towards all, let us strive to finish the work we are in and bind up the nation's wounds, to do all which may achieve and cherish a just and lasting peace. In December, Sherman took Savannah, Georgia. He then sent a telegram to Lincoln. I beg to present you as a Christmas gift the city of Savannah with 150 heavy guns and about 25,000 bales of cotton. Grant's Virginia campaign. After taking Savannah, Sherman moved through the Carolinas seeking to meet up with Grant's troops in Virginia. Since May 1864, Grant and his generals had been fighting savage battles against Lee's forces. In battle after battle, Grant would attack, rest, then attack again, all the while moving south towards Richmond. At the Battle of the Wilderness in May 1864, Union and Confederate forces fought in a tangle of trees and brush so thick they could barely see each other. Grant lost over 17,000 men, but he pushed on. Whatever happens, he told Lincoln, we will not retreat. At Spotsylvania and Cold Harbor, the fighting continued. Again, the losses were staggering. Grant's attack in June at Cold Harbor cost him 7,000 men, most in the first few minutes of battle. Some Union troops were so sure they would die in battle that they pinned their names and addresses to their jackets so they could be identified later. In June 1864, Grant's armies arrived at Petersburg, just south of Richmond. Unable to break through the Confederate defenses, the Union forces dug trenches and settled for a long siege. The two sides faced off for 10 months. In the end, Lee could not hold out. Grant was drawing a noose around Richmond, so Lee pulled out, leaving the Confederate capital undefended. The Union Army marched into Richmond on April 3rd. One Richmond woman recalled, exactly at 8 o'clock, the Confederate flag that fluttered above the Capitol came down, and the stars and stripes were up. We covered our faces and cried aloud. Surrender at Appomattox. From Richmond to Petersburg, Lee fled west, while Grant followed in pursuit. Lee wanted to continue fighting, but he knew that the situation was hopeless. He sent a message to General Grant that he was ready to surrender. On April 9, 1865, Lee and Grant met in a small Virginia town, the Appomattox Courthouse, to arrange the surrender. Grant later wrote that his joy at the moment was mixed with sadness. I felt like anything rather than rejoicing at the downfall of a foe who had fought so long and valiantly and had suffered so much for a cause, though that cause was, I believe, one of the worst for which people have ever fought, and one for which there was the least excuse. I do not question, however, the sincerity of the great mass of those who were opposed to us. Grant offered generous terms of surrender. After laying down their arms, Confederates could return home in peace, taking their private possessions and horses with them. Grant also gave food to the hungry and Confederate soldiers. After 4 long years, the Civil War was coming to a close. Its effects would continue, however, changing the country forever. In the next section, you will learn about the long-term consequences of the Civil War.